So welcome back, everybody, and I hope everyone's had the chance to maybe stretch your legs and grab a tea or coffee. And it's great to have you all now back with us here for the second session of today's webinar. So this morning we focused really on the potential that fixed wireless access can offer, and the role that it can play in helping to meet some of the targets and deliver the gigabit society in Europe. And one of the key areas, of course, is funding and financing for the rollout of these networks. And we've touched a little bit in that first session on some of the questions related to that. But we're delighted now to have a session that's going to be focusing a lot more detail on the key funding initiatives. So looking at public funding initiatives to support fixed wireless access and how member states and how companies can make the most of the support that's available. So really looking forward to what's going to be some interesting discussions, I'm sure, on this really important topic and really important part of the discussion. So to maybe explain more and to introduce the topics and our panelists for the session, I'm delighted to now welcome to the stage Michael Opitz from Arthur D. Little. Michael, great. It's great to have you here with us, and welcome. And yeah, as I said, really looking forward to the discussions here. So without further ado, I'll pass over to you to tell us more.
Thank you, Dan, for the kind introduction. A warm welcome to everybody from my side as well. It was good to hear this morning. The session was very lively, very good insights and good discussion, and I hope we will have such a lively discussion here as well. In this session, we will shed a bit more light on existing and potential future funding mechanisms, on real projects and their business cases, and the overall outlook for fixed wireless access in the next years, also in the light of the EU policy goals and supporting guidelines, as we have heard this morning. Before we start with the panel, I want to present some thoughts and considerations to you, a couple of slides, which of course will be distributed to you if you like after the session. And then if you can just go on. Thank you. So fixed wireless access, as we heard this morning, is not a new technology, but I still want to give a bit more background and explanation to set the frame for our discussion. As you know, it's a hybrid system of wired and wireless networks to offer fixed broadband and potentially also ultra broadband or gigabit broadband services. So normally the BTS, the tower, is connected with a fiber backhaul. Alternatively, sometimes it's also just a radio link serving as a backhaul, but then the signal is distributed to a CPE, a receiving antenna, and then distributes it to the user's home. I have here the definition of Ericsson, which reads a bit long, but I think it's very precise. It's a connection that provides primary broadband access through wireless wide area mobile networks enabled customer premises equipment, and there are a couple of CPEs around, various form factors that can be indoor CPEs, desktop or window, or also outdoor CPEs like rooftop antennas or wall-mounted antennas. And it does not include portable and battery-based Wi-Fi routers or dongles. As we heard this morning already, fixed wireless access solutions are here around for about 2 decades, starting with WiMAX and then gaining much more success with LTE. And now the question is, with 5G being realized and deployed, does that give us the uplift we all want to see in terms of uptake of fixed wireless access, as we can expect much higher bandwidth and of course better latencies and other parameters which we'll talk about. As of today, we see fixed wireless access solution being provided either over 3.5 gigahertz band, the 5 gigahertz band, or millimetric bands like 26 or 28 gigahertz, which of course provide much higher performance possibilities, but we all know that the range will be much lower, the coverage range, and it will be not that easy to be deployed, including the line of sight issues we have. If you go to the next slide, please, Dan. Couple of considerations why performance is picking up and why that might give new and additional potential to fixed wireless access. We all know that 5G provides a much higher spectral efficiency, and with the millimeter wave bands, the available spectrum is just much higher. And overall, the cost due to both of those aspects to deploy 5G can be much lower as compared to the LTE 4G solution. And here on the right-hand side, you see a couple of data points about performance, both theoretical as well as detected, both for the upload and download side for the different technologies. And as you can see on the right-hand side, very right-hand side, in the millimeter wave band, we really see the gigabit speed we all expect. If you go to the next page, please. This is a consideration about cost of deployment. This is, of course, very aggregated figure. There might be different figures around, or you may have heard about different figures, but when we look at rural and urban areas, then we see that the cost for deployment will be dramatically reduced with fixed wireless access solutions, which is pretty clear because you do not have to dig all the access to the households, to connect the households with fiber, which may turn out to be extremely expensive depending on the soil you have to build. So certain areas are just very unattractive for fiber deployment. And both for rural and urban areas, you can see a high cost advantage of fixed wireless access solutions, which demonstrate and underline that it's from a cost perspective really attractive. And we will discuss what does that mean for the market take up and attractiveness. If you go on to the next slide, please. Here we see the go-to-market models or the different use cases. They were also mentioned this morning already. It can be used for urban densification, where you overbuild or try to overbuild existing other technologies, including FTTX areas. But then you will be positioned rather at the low end with your price position, and we see it about 15 to 20% below the traditional or official FTTX propositions. The second, probably most prominent model is the rural expansion, potentially also suburban expansion, where you compete against, let's say, technologies like DSL, which just do not provide enough bandwidth, also not in foreseeable future. And here you can, of course, compete on the existing price level or even be a bit above that because you provide a superior bandwidth and other parameters. And also heard this morning, there's also this temporary fixed wireless access offering, which may be used, for instance, if you want to preempt a competitor building out an area and you try to find customers to this solution and avoid them to migrate to another technology. But we also had other use cases this morning, like the Airbnb housing. And there we also see a bit of pricing points below the traditional propositions. If you go to the next slide, please. It's interesting to see where the uptake in which countries in Europe is the highest. I mean, looking at the world, taking a global perspective, we all know that especially, for instance, in the US, it's very, very successful. Verizon, T-Mobile, US are very successful players in that respect. In Europe, we see a bit of mixed picture with Italy being really leading the pack, but rather low uptake rates in the other countries. And maybe what we heard this morning in terms of funds being available and also the technology advantages and cost advantages we're just talking about, there might be a new good reason for FWA to become more and more attractive in the market. And the last slide from my perspective, Dan, if you may, is shedding a bit of light on some specialized players here too. On the left-hand side in Italy, as this is a very prominent market in that respect. And I think we will hear more about one of those players later on. They are quite considerable already in size. If you see look at the customer base, 500, 670K customers, but other players in other markets like in the Czech Republic, in Ireland, also in France, they are very, very small players, and it will be interesting to learn a bit which size of projects we are talking about. when thinking of such fixed wireless access deployments. So that's it from my side, just as some introductory remarks. Thank you for your attention. And then I would like to introduce the panelists to you, who will all give also a short intro note, and then we can start the discussion. I want also to invite you and encourage you to post your questions in the chat, that you can also all participate here in the discussion. So I think Harald Gruber should be first coming up and presenting some introductory slides. Harald, a warm welcome to you as well. Good to see you again here on the stage. Harald is the head of digital infrastructure division at the European Investment Bank, and so very close to the market in terms of which kind of business cases do you see, which kind of deployments do you see, and really looking forward to your introductory remarks. Over to you, Harald.
Yeah, thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to address this audience. Now, representing the European Investment Bank as the public policy bank of Europe, the bank is pursuing projects in supporting European policies, and clearly very high capacity network rollout is one of the priorities of the European Union policies, and therefore the bank is fully supporting this. Next slide, please. So what I would briefly talk to you about is basically give you the public banker's view of how this technology should and can be supported. Now, I mean, just very briefly on the bank is owned by the member states of the European Union, and we are quite exposed to the digital infrastructure. We are the largest institution worldwide supporting digital infrastructure. We support about 2.5 to 3 billion per year in terms of loans. Now, clearly, as a public policy bank, we act a little bit differently from private bankers. The only thing that we have in common that we want our money one way or the other back, because these are loans. The projects need to fulfill a set of characteristics when they are evaluated by the bank. They must be economically, technically, and financially viable, and of course they need also to pass a number of environment and procurement checks. Next slide, please. So just to tell you that basically we act like a banker, like bankers, but we do have additional checks which justify basically quite a large department of engineers and economists to look specifically on the projects, and therefore we have a very good understanding of the technologies and of the markets worldwide. Now, the EIB has financed fixed wireless projects. I mean, both as a sort of standalone companies, like for instance, we have seen on the previous slide, like Linkem in Italy, or also when they are part of sort of mobile operators, when they do have project components that relate to fixed wireless access parts. Now, from our point of view, fixed wireless access is a very useful technology, especially when it has to satisfy certain niche needs. I mean, we have seen before, so Michael's presentation, that they can be act in a very good complementary way to basically 5G and fiber to the home rollout. So they could, in principle, very efficiently cover areas which are very rural, so basically with very low population density, or which are in other ways very difficult to cover, or which only need sort of a temporary coverage or once in a while coverage. So it is a very flexible technology from our point of view, and it can be a good tool in the toolbox for very high capacity networks as foreseen by the European policies. Next slide, please. I mean, last but not least, fixed wireless access also fulfill the Paris, it's so-called Paris Alliance, because the bank is now basically closely following up on Paris alignments. All the projects that the bank is financing, because it wants to be the climate bank of Europe, also need to fulfill those criteria. And fixed wireless access passes that criteria. Not all telecom technologies pass that criteria, by the way. Now, in terms of what is the market potential, I mean, it is tendentially fairly large. It may sometimes be only temporary, but nevertheless, it is fairly large market potential there. Because what we have done is we have basically evaluated the investment requirement to fulfill the gigabit for society for Europe targets in the European Union. And the amounts are quite sizable. This graph somehow depicts the setup where it needs to be done. And if you look at where the arrow is, so basically more the rural sites, you can see that the investment requirement is fairly large. I mean, it's for all technologies, but I believe that a substantial chunk can be also filled out of that by fixed wireless access technologies. Next slide, please. Now, the EIB is basically supporting projects. So in that sense, we are looking, when we talk about fixed wireless access, they use typically 5G frequencies. So we look at 5G projects because they are sort of the complement of that. And the bank is fully supporting projects in that field, both from the development of the technologies up to the network deployment. And I mean, all stages now are basically in action, because 5G networks are being rolled out, along with it the fixed wireless access network. And so we do look now at projects of that kind. Next slide, please. Now, very briefly only here, it's a complicated graph. So basically, we look at projects. Fixed wireless access can be standalone projects of companies which are only specialized on that, or they can be part of sort of diversified or vertically integrated operators which do have fixed wireless access as a part of the business. Now, what we look now is we look at a project and to see to what extent such projects can be supported by resources that have been made available from EU resources, like resilience facility or Connecting Europe facility, also InvestEU. So basically, we do very often combine the different types of financing. And we can combine them, or also we can approach such project on basically on own resources of the EIB resources only. It depends a little bit on the mix of the risks profile and the promoters, and it will be dealt in a sort of a case by case. And basically, what matters here is when we look at the project, what is the risk profile of the project, and what is the size of the project. And depending on that, and this is the box on the bottom, it shows that there are different financial tools which can provide the financing. Next slide, please. So to conclude, fixed wireless is, in our view, a part of the 5G expansion, and therefore it is fulfilling the gigabit society targets, and therefore fully supported by policies. It is a sort of a natural evolution of the technologies. There are high investment needs, and part of it can be carried by fixed wireless access, and especially in rural areas. And they need to be supported by projects in that field. Last but not least, there's also a considerable attention to be brought to cybersecurity aspects on the type of suppliers that are being used. But these are all parts of the due diligence of the bank. So I will stop here for the time being. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Harold, for your introduction. And I think it seems that if there's enough money available to fund those programs, and we're very keen to hear later what kind of projects you already finance and which maybe not, and for what reasons, both on the technical and commercial side. Thanks a lot, Harold. And now introducing to you Marit Palovirka. Good morning, Marit. She's Director for Regulatory Affairs at ITNO. Warm welcome to you as well, and good to see you here again as well. And yeah, over to you for your introductory remarks.
Thank you, Michael, and hello, everybody. And a big thank you also from my side to the organizers for having invited us again to discuss connectivity within the EU, which of course is always very interesting and important also for our future. So talking about fixed wireless access, and I think we had two already very enlightening presentations from Michael and Harold on what it is actually, and I will not spend a lot of time explaining that, but I will say a few words about the operator's perspective. So what do we as operators, or where do we see fixed wireless access playing a role in the deployment plans as we go on and continue fiber and 5G deployments? So we've been actually at ETNO very consistent for a long time that the underlying principle for all connectivity deployment should be technology neutrality. And this means, of course, not favoring any specific technologies when we go and deliver connectivity to citizens. And we've also, in that respect, pleased that when BEREC defined their guidelines for very high capacity networks, I think it was 2020, that fixed wireless access was included in those guidelines. And it is really this use of multiple technologies that we feel that is the right way for us as Europe, as operators as well, to try and achieve these very ambitious digital decade targets by 2030. So taking the next steps. And it's really to keep an open mind with the set of technologies that we have at our disposal. And as Michael already said, so there are some specific use cases that we see for fixed wireless access. And from our perspective, perhaps the most relevant one is the rural areas and remote areas, because as we are kind of looking towards the gigabit society, I mean, the gigabit connectivity goals, so digital decade, rural areas still very much remain a challenge. And here that we see that fixed wireless access can be a good opportunity. And with the enablement or upgrade with 5G, it also then means that 5G-enabled fixed wireless access can have the capability to provide gigabit speeds in certain scenarios. And maybe just to provide a bit of data from some of our reports. So the Boston Consulting Group did a report for us for ETNO last year, I think it was. And they estimated that fixed wireless access will be an important 5G use case for operators, and that by 2025, it would represent about 5% of operators' total revenue. So you can already see that it's perhaps not the mainstream technology, but it's still a relevant part of the connectivity portfolio, if you like. You also saw from Michael's slides that some of the ETNO members have offerings and do play in this market too. More recently this year, we do our annual report, State of Digital, with Analysis Mason, and they also confirmed this trend by saying that the popularity for fixed wireless access is growing, but that there is this fill the gap nature, and it was already referred to. So there tends to be a kind of temporary nature to fixed wireless access. So when other gigabit connectivity or gigabit technologies come to play, then the fixed wireless offer tends to be moved aside. But this is where we are today from the operator's point of view. So how about the role of public funding then? And just to say that, well, we've been again quite consistent at ETNO. So we've been saying for a long time that operators believe that private funding and private financing should be the priority when we are deploying and upgrading networks. And public funding should only be used where we see a clear market failure scenario. And this is, of course, because we do not want to see any unnecessary market distortions taking place. And if you think about market failure areas in the EU, then there is, of course, an overlap of those rural and remote areas where we often don't see a business case that would justify a gigabit investment from the operator's side. And combining this with the tech neutrality principle, which of course should also apply in the public funding framework, it hasn't always been so in the past, at least. So there would seem to be a kind of an ideal match between fixed wireless access and public funding, because you could potentially then use it for the rural scenarios. And also, of course, we have funding available there, and those are the market failure areas. However, having said that, so if you look at the cost aspects in more detail, and again, Michael already mentioned that the FTTH cost can be very, very high. So in the last 10% of premises to be passed, they can really rise to several thousands of euros per premise. So that can be preventive in terms of prohibitive in terms of the investment effort. So in some way, there can be room for 5G enabled fixed wireless access and other hybrid solutions, as perhaps there's less risk in terms of investment at the initial short and medium term. However, if you want to achieve genuine gigabit services in remote areas using 5G fixed wireless access, there are some considerable additional costs that we should take into account. And just to name a few, so there is a need for engineer-installed outdoor antennas to optimize performance. So there is some extra OpEx spending, if you like, going in. And of course, also the upgrade, there needs to be an upgrade of the remote cells to 5G. And this also applies for areas where perhaps there is not yet a commercial business case for 5G. So in any case, to enable the gigabit speed fixed wireless access, you would have to upgrade the 5G and the cells to 5G. I already a bit referred to it. So also typically fixed wireless access tends to have a higher OpEx than fiber to the home. And also importantly, shorter asset life than fiber to the home. So when you then think about the potential challenges from the point of view of public funding, you need to reflect on these things. And so shorter asset life, for example, does it then mean that there is, let's say, a very defined life cycle for this solution? And we know that, of course, with public funding, there are sometimes obligations to keep the solutions running for a certain number of years, for example. So all of these things need to be very carefully assessed. Similarly, the CapEx-OpEx ratio can be important. So at least in the past, EU funding used to have some thresholds on how much of the funds you can use on CapEx and OpEx. So if we are using a technology which perhaps needs more OpEx, then that also could be a question mark. And maybe then just a few words about the currently available funding schemes and also some of the policies that we are currently discussing in Brussels and across the EU. So, of course, perhaps the biggest funding pocket at the moment, or the source, is the Recovery and Resilience Facility, and the most recent one, which was established as a response to the pandemic and trying to help European countries to pick up their recovery efforts. And the good news, of course, for our industry was that 20% of these funds were to be allocated towards digital transformation. I don't have any comprehensive data on what is exactly the share of fixed wireless access. I'm thinking that Philip, who is speaking after me, might want to contribute towards that. But we do see that in some countries, of course, there's been a good positive impact from this RRF fund. And I also would like to say that, again, we still believe that private funding and financing should have the priority. And in a way, it's been also good news that we see that some of these funds have been used rather for digitization of the society, for demand generation, for skills, etc. Because even though it doesn't directly contribute towards the infrastructure, it does reinforce the connectivity ecosystem at large. So especially then, potentially being an indirect solution also to boost connectivity in especially rural areas, etc. So we could be thinking about, digitized agriculture, for example, etc. That could then boost demand in the rural areas and the areas that are currently perhaps considered as market failure areas. So that's of course something that we are working on, but rather at the member state level. And then perhaps a few words on the ongoing discussions in the context of the state aid guidelines. So some of you may know that in the EU, we're currently reviewing the state aid guidelines on broadband deployment. And these are, of course, very crucial for us because they will define what kind of projects are eligible for public funding in general, and also under which conditions. So it is a kind of a baseline policy that sets the tone then to the implementation with public funds. And I just like to raise a few concepts that we've been supporting in this process of reviewing these guidelines. And one is that public funds from our perspective should focus on gap funding. So I already said that public funding is not, from our point of view, the mainstream solution, but it really should be focusing on gap funding. And this is then indeed to counter the risk of market distortions, but also increasingly overbuild. So we see increasingly overbuild in, of course, mainly in urban areas, but also suburban areas of fiber, etc. So then it becomes even more critical to assess where exactly can public funds play a crucial role, so that we are not, of course, then creating overbuild and artificially, let's say, increase competition, which probably will not work out in the end anyway. And also then, of course, not using public taxpayers' money on overbuilding and contributing towards infrastructure that perhaps is there already. The second thing is what we call an incentive effect. So we believe that public funds should play a role to incentivize private investment. So, and this is, I think, quite relevant, especially with fixed wireless access, because it is a kind of stopgap solution. So yes, this could be something that then we can discuss as well a bit further. But I will conclude my remarks here and look forward to then questions and as part of the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marit, for those insights. And I think you nicely linked back to what Harald already said when we talk about, because Harald said they fund economically viable projects, and you just made the point that even with fixed wireless access to reach the last percentages of households with gigabit speed might not be that viable at the end of the day. So let's discuss that further. And also like the link to the point of this morning, the new state aid broadband guidelines, and you were talking about clear market failure scenarios, and we learned this morning that those guidelines would kind of soften or broaden the scope of those scenarios, and would be good to discuss what that means for FWA later on. Wonderful. Then let me introduce Philippe Lefebvre to you. Philippe is head of sector 5G deployment strategy at the European Commission. Also good to have you here again, Philippe. And over to you for your introductory remarks.
Thank you, Michael, and thank you for the opportunity to exchange with the interested community on fixed wireless access, which is certainly a solution on which we know too little at the moment. The nice thing to represent the European Commission is that I don't have to present the institutions. There is also a negative side, but I will not tell you today. So when I think to fixed wireless access, I think of two decisive factors that makes it more relevant or will make it more relevant in the future than in the past. First of all, as it has been amply said, the Digital Decade program and the fact that once it's cast in law, we have the legal and political, but also the legal obligation to fulfill the promise of gigabit connection to 100% of the households by the end of the decade. So that's a change compared to the past where we didn't have this legal obligation. So we need to look at solutions for the last percent of connections to achieve that goal. The second factor is that 5G in light of sight is, to my knowledge, the only technology that promise to deliver fiber-like connectivity in the end. Satellite could, to some extent, also reach high capacity. There are satellites now with throwing speed of up to 200 megabits per second, and with low orbit satellite, response time will be shorter. But it's not clear yet if the gigabit to this mass of population, because if we look at the rural or scattered population, it could reach 10–15% of the population. So it's still a large population to be served by other means like satellite. However, operators and investors must compare wireless solution in any case with other solutions, so with fiber. Also, I've always wondered why aerial deployment of fiber is not more popular, because after all, we have connected 100% of our population to electricity in all member states. Already it's 100% in most member states in the 90s. So why couldn't we reach, in the end, all residential units through a cable on poles, fiber cables on poles for the last, the most, even in difficult, let's say, deployment situation? I don't know, it's just an open question, but so there is a mix of technologies that could be considered. Back to investment, looking at this mix from an investment viewpoint, because it's the theme of our panel, we see that in terms of investment, the private market fulfills mainly niche markets at the moment. For example, the secondary house market, summer houses in Finland, or holiday vacation houses in France. They have their own business model. But in terms of connecting primary residents with fixed wireless access, we have very limited experience. I think Italy is, as was mentioned, the most prominent example, but it's also done there with public funding attached to it in many cases, as far as I know. When we look at the EU instruments then available, I will not go through the inventory. It was made already by Franco Accordino, the head of unit for broadband investment, and also by Harald. So we have a range of investment, but I looked at how they have been used in the past, and I must say that, for example, if I look at the regional funding and agricultural funding, also agricultural fund for regional deployment, I see no fixed wireless access project at the moment. There is one pilot in Spain, in Galicia, already based on 5G, but this is really the only example I could find there. If I look at Connecting Europe Broadband Fund, that's a fund where I would have imagined we would have a few examples, because it's targeted to entrepreneurs who are working on targeted deployment of broadband with innovative approaches, including innovative financing approaches. And there are 8 projects, 500 million were committed, and no fixed wireless access. So net, it seems that in Europe we are far from the situation in the US, where you have 4 million residences connected through fixed wireless access. But this may not really matter, because what we look here, what is really our core focus, is the digital decade and the substitute to fiber, not simply to extend the mobile coverage or the DSL-like service like in the past. So if I look now at the opportunities, there is the RRF, that was the Recovery Fund, Recovery and Resilience Fund, as was mentioned several times. But you have to remember that the RRF is available mainly in some countries, not in all countries, because it depends on how countries have suffered from a GDP wise from the COVID. So there are countries that get a lot more funds than the others. So it's no surprise to find a few projects, mainly in Spain, Italy, who are big beneficiaries of the RRF. But even there, I see Italy, for example, plans to finance gigabit connectivity to at least 8.5 million units by 2026. Among which 500,000 to scattered household. And then they mentioned that it could be done through a mix of fixed wireless access, fiber, and so on. So there is a potential. In Spain, also Spain, has an ambitious intermediate target of 100 megabits to all population by 2025. And there you can see that they call for project already in gray and white area with symmetric speeds of 300 megabits per second. But we can expect that the next round may show then in the rural deployment some applications. For example, there is a plan to issue vouchers to 125,000 residents to connect, and also 11,000 SMEs to connect very remote residential units. and this, of course, is a natural target for fixed wireless access. So RF is one. So there are also the other possibilities, among which, for example, we could look at spectrum prices. For example, there is the interesting, in my view, case of Norway, where Norway, what they have done after the auctions of 5G of the Pioneer band, they have offered the new licensees the opportunity to get a discount on license fees in exchange for rural area coverage with high-speed broadband. So the three operators which had got spectrum were interested in this. So that's a way that indirectly through public financing, you could have a dynamic approach to solutions for covering rural areas. Also, we could look at the verticals. In the future, verticals may have need to bring the fiber far in rural areas for smart agriculture, or along, for example, the 5G corridors along highways that the Commission is promoting a lot through the Connecting Europe facility. From there, you could imagine extensions to residential areas around these these areas of economic interest. Finally, the fiber would be financed through economic to economic actors, with or without public financing, and then you can, using or not public money, you can also extend to improve rural coverage. That's also a possible interesting approach. I will finish by saying that what can we do for the future? I looked at a study that we will publish by the end of the month called Investing in Local and Regional Gigabit Networks. So this is not about fixed wireless access, it's about all kinds of broadband deployment in local and regional setups. I think Franz Char of IDATE must know a lot about this study because he was part of it. And there are interesting recommendations, for example, that we could use the broadband competence offices to increase competencies on how to set up projects to reach out to rural residential areas. So not only technical, but also financial competences. And they suggested, for example, to have things like special events, broadband academy, or even maybe a portal to help the matchmaking, because one of the issues is that these local or development projects are so small that they lack access to information, they lack the critical size and so on. So there's a lot I think public services can make to aggregate this demand amount and to increase the know-how that is necessary to set up these projects. So I close here. I think talking to my colleagues, we see still fixed wireless access as a temporary solution, as a bridge solution, awaiting fiber to the premises, or even a mobile 5G, that it would be so good that it provides anyway residential fixed service that is almost gigabit quality. But this is a technology that has still to prove its effectiveness. But 5G, as I said, is a game changer, and the jury is out now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Philippe, for your introductory remarks. So I learned that not many of the funds, almost none, have been used so far for fixed wireless access. But the point you made with regards to verticals like smart agriculture and the potential to extend those deployments to residential areas and to cover the very rural households is a very interesting aspect. So we need to discuss later if potentially funding mechanisms, requirements, preconditions need to be changed in order to go into this synergetic direction, I want to call it. Great. So let me start with the first round of questions before I take questions from the audience, which are already popping up. And of course, we go ladies first, Marit. So the first question I would address to you. So recognizing that high speeds internet's importance to economic development, many governments across the globe are implementing sizable programs to fund or even subsidize building broadband networks in underserved areas, as we discussed. Although these programs typically favor wired solutions, they are increasingly technology agnostic, as you also pointed out, as long as the service can meet minimum performance thresholds. From your perspective, what should be considered as the balance between funds allocated to fixed and fixed wireless networks when it comes to supporting the roll-off of broadband networks in underserved areas?
Yes, thank you, Michael. So I think indeed I did already touch on some of those points, and I think you said yourself that the key principles still should still be the technology neutrality, and I think it's we shouldn't be thinking that the funds is just an instrument, a means to an end. So what we need to really see is what's the demand in a specific scenario, and if it's a rural market, for example, what could be the best solution for this community in the immediate term, but also in the longer term. And I think that's where that's how you start thinking about, from also operators' perspective, of what is the kind of offer that would be, yes, commercially viable, but then also would have some long-term, let's say, sustainability in that specific area. And then you have the question of the business case. So either there is sufficient demand or not, and you might then have the public funds coming in or not. But the premise, I think, would be to analyze the demand in these areas rather than jumping into immediately with the public funds offering in a specific area. And you may know that we also, as part of the European Code of Communication, so the operators have a mapping obligation. So operators have an obligation to report their investment plans 3 years in advance to the regulators. Exactly, so that regulators then have a bit of an overview on who is planning to invest where, etc., etc. And this, of course, becomes very important as well when we look at the public funding allocation. So if authorities see that, hey, these guys are not yet there, but they are planning to be there in 2 years' time, so maybe that's then a kind of a warning sign on perhaps this is not the first place where we will then allocate public funding, because there will be, there's a promise of private investment. And I also want to just touch on briefly on the state aid guidelines. So we see very positive that now the guidelines are considering the fixed market separately and the mobile market separately. So we think that the analysis on how public funding should be allocated for these specific technologies should be different, because they are different markets. And then, of course, there are examples, perhaps national circumstances, in which you can also consider them together, and this would perhaps be the case for the fixed wireless access, but this would be rather an exception.
Thank you, Marit. So, of course, we want to avoid overbuild by public funding. That's key. Otherwise, on the other hand, an announcement itself is probably not enough, right? I mean, it must come to action at any point in time. Yeah, that's also clear. Thank you. Philip, if I may address a question to you from your perspective. How can member states and connectivity providers looking to roll out FWA networks ensure that they are in a position to best take advantage of the funding and subsidies that are available?
Yeah, the natural tendency is to first talk to their operators present in the region. But of course, sometimes that's where the problem lies, the interest of the operators and what is feasible. The profitability is such that the operators cannot provide a direct help. So they go typically to regional or level, or to the Ministry of Communication. They should have awareness of the financing that is available nationally and at the EU level. Then you have also the broadband competence offices. That could be good contacts for them to know what's going on. But there is also something interesting, I think, that will develop in the future, is this digital decade program machinery that we will put in place. Maybe a bit heavy, but will have the advantage that you will have national roadmaps doing even more than what Marie described. Not only you will have an idea of the investment planned by the operator. That comes from the code. The code gives you that, but it will also give you the whole strategy that will be deployed by member states to address these different issues, and to finance the financing plans. And by having that, we will be able to compare, and member states will be able to compare between them what works, what doesn't work, where is fixed wireless access best, the best solution, where you have drawbacks. So as we go towards 2030, we will build this database of practical experience in technical and financing experience that will be shared at European level, and that will be used also in the recommendations or the policy actions that will be required and agreed with the EU level in all member states. So this is a powerful, I think, instrument.
Okay, thank you very much, Philip. And Harold, as we already touched upon before in your presentation, we would like to understand, as you said, you have funded the one or other project, FWA project. How do you look at those business cases compared to, for instance, fiber cases from a technical perspective, from an economical perspective, from the competitive environment, and also what you mentioned, CapEx equity or CapEx debt ratio, the repayment period, etc. Can you elaborate a bit on the kind of business cases?
Yeah, I mean, when we look at projects, normally we look at a sort of a business plan, what the project is. Now, you can make perhaps two big distinctions. One is those specialized providers of fixed wireless access. I mean, they are just doing that. So they have an issue of having access to frequencies. They themselves have to somehow piggyback from somebody who has frequencies, so they have to get access for frequencies, and so therefore they somehow are fenced in by frequencies and by their business plan, and that's what it is. So they will stick to that one, and they would try, in the context of that, try to maximize, take up whatever the coverage is they have. So it's sort of standard business plan that you would have perhaps also for sort of mobile operators, and so. I mean, yes, there are fairly well developed approaches, and you can set out what's the value of the companies depending on the take-up rates, on the performance of how much the users will pay and things like that. So it depends. I mean, very often those are also very much in urban areas, so they fill also urban areas, not only very remote areas. So in that sense, they're very much akin to mobile operators very often. So that's the one thing. The other one is basically if you have sort of mobile operators which do have 5G license on themselves, and they have a mix of technology. I mean, they do 5G technologies, cellular technologies, and they can also use fixed wireless access. And depending on the parameters of the geographics and the business plan, they have a broader thing. They can look at the fixed wireless as a standalone project, or they can see it integrated in the overall business plan of the technologies. Because for them, sometimes having fixed wireless customers, it's a handy tool also to migrate customers. Basically, it may be that a certain area has such a high take-up rate that you may build out in a fully fledged mobile or possibly even in fiber network. So I think the options that are open for mobile operators, and maybe very often our mobile operators are really fully integrated all technologies operators. I think they have a very broad range of commercial options. So it's very much, if you want, on a case by case. And I think in the same way, that's also when the subsidy game starts. I mean, it becomes a very difficult thing, because there's no optimal option. It depends on a case by case. Sometimes basically subsidizing fixed wireless may be a very good idea. Sometimes it may be a suboptimal idea, because you miss out on certain technological option which maybe an integrated provider could provide, and therefore being sort of not tying it to a certain technology could be a big advantage. So again, there is no clear-cut answer, but there are several ways of approaching it to get a sort of an efficient outcome. That's what we are normally trying to do, to see to what extent it is a good investment, or if it's a good use of public money.
So maybe if you are allowed to share some more detail on the one or other specific case, of course, without mentioning names, but what are typical payback periods for such a case as compared to fiber? And did the, let's say, promises of the business case in terms of take-up rates and so on really realize, or what is your experience with that?
I mean, the experience is that basically fixed wireless access is much shorter. I mean, very often you have even very small regional companies. I mean, they sort of almost hit and run, so type of thing. So because the basically the capex requirements, they are not enormous. So therefore, you can basically run it on a very low capacity intensity infrastructure business type of thing. So it depends if they then do a lot of investment in terms of marketing. Then of course then it changes. But purely technology investment, it's overseeable. So the more is basically on the marketing, on getting basically the customer equipment out to the customer, and basically having technologies for keeping customers locked into a sufficiently long time.
Yeah. Thank you. There's also a question, Harald, directed to you from in the chat. Has the EIB financed FWA investments for big MNOs? The question.
Yes, for big MNOs. The thing is that, I mean, when we approach a big MNO, we normally have relatively large loans. So the fixed wireless component tends to be very small compared to the overall cost. So I mean, if say a fixed wireless project is in the order of 40-50 million, which is already fairly large. I mean, when we look at larger operators, we talk about project cost is 10 times that much. So I mean, then if they have a small fixed wireless component, I mean, we include that because in our view it is an eligible project cost, and it makes sense when it makes sense. But it's small compared.
Okay, thank you. So let me take a question from the audience, a colleague from the US who stood up very early in the morning. So we should definitely take his question. It goes to you, Marit. So how many more homes will be offered service if you get the requested subsidies, and how much will your members raise investment if they get the subsidy? And the subsequent question, is there any reason that European telcos, including Deutsche Telekom, wouldn't build a network with similar coverage to DT, so T-Mobile and Verizon in the US? What is your perspective on that?
Yes, so quite complex issues. It's an interesting question. This, how many homes you can connect with a certain amount of money. And actually, in the lead up to the discussions on the resilience and recovery facility, we were contacted as ETNO by some member states, and they were trying to ask us, so how much does it cost to actually connect one house? Because they needed to do the funding plans to allocate the public funding for the different connectivity initiatives. And we don't have one answer to that. So I was in touch with some investors in London, and they do this kind of analysis, of course, on a regular basis. And we get a range from around 200 euro per house or per premise to about 2,000 euro per premise, just depending on where it is. Is it urban? Is it rural? It's also country specific. So there are different, costs for permits, for building, etc., etc. There are so many ifs and buts that it's very difficult to actually give a number on how much does it cost to connect a premise. So hence to this question, of course, then, this will be the requested subsidies, then you will have to see how far you can go depending on where you're going to invest it. And, if there's then a link to raise investment, if I understand that correctly, it's to add on with private investment. So, of course, public funding can have, as I was saying earlier, an incentivizing effect. So hopefully it's used in a way that it reinforces the connectivity ecosystem, either by covering some of the baseline fiber costs, which are very heavy, or then potentially by also supporting digitization and skills and all these kind of soft factors. So I think, these are all good things. Maybe I'll just quickly comment. I don't want to take all the time, but on the US case, what's the difference between the US and Europe? So yes, I'm afraid this goes down to the regulatory framework, which is very different on these two continents. And when I say regulatory framework, I mean in Europe, we have, in terms of what is the similarity, I guess, everywhere, is that data traffic is growing exponentially. And telecom operators have more and more data to deliver, which means that they have to expand their networks, they have to reinforce their networks, and also, of course, then at the same time, expand the reach. But what is different in Europe is that, for example, our operators, we have the open internet regulation, which obliges operators to deliver all traffic to end users. So we have an obligation to deliver traffic to end users. This is not the case in the US. In Europe, prices are still, consumer prices and wholesale prices are still to some extent regulated, which is not the case in the US. So prices in Europe are actually far lower than in the US, and the operators' capacity to increase consumer prices is rather limited. Then you have the market structure competition policy. So this has been disincentivizing consolidation, I think, for many, many years. So we have a very fragmented market structure. We have some 100 operators for the EU, 2 to 3 big ones per country, plus the small ones. So again, very different to the US. So I will leave it there, but that's our take on this matter.
Thank you, Marit. Then another question, probably or potentially to Philippe or Harald. Why, from your perspective?
Would you mind, Michael, if I react very shortly on Marit's comments? And would you mind? And I will not redo the ETNO conference on fair share by OTTs and so on, which is a very important and valid topic. But I think here we're talking about mobile coverage in the US, which is out of scope because, at least from a public perspective, we are only interested here in fixed access gigabit speeds. And in the US, we have looked also from a mobile viewpoint, through the 5G observatory, but also through direct data, at the quality of service. And if undeniably 5G is more advanced in urban areas in the US, on the countryside, you have speed sometimes that is lower than a good quality network, 4G network in Germany, for example, which is a 5G service, because 5G allows you to increase performance, but also at the same performance to increase your coverage, which is also an option used by some, at the moment, at this early deployment stage by US operators. So you have to see that it's all relative, I would say.
Thank you, Philippe. So Harald, the question from the panelists about the adoption rate of FWA connections in Italy as compared to other countries. We know that the Italian national broadband plans acknowledge that they cannot deploy fiber everywhere and hence are a bit more open towards those kind of solutions. Would you like to comment on that aspect?
Yeah, I mean, there are perhaps, I would say it's a patchwork of factors that perhaps contribute to this extraordinary result that fixed wireless is so penetrated in the Italian market than elsewhere. I mean, I believe that among the most important components are most of those networks are typically of a regional nature. So you have certain type of regions which have clearly intensified the activities for that because, the operators were slow in rolling out networks in certain areas, in certain countries, and so basically the regional governments wanted to give it a kick and try to basically incentivize new operators to roll out such wireless networks, especially regions which do have quite an important rural part of the housing stock. Then I think another component is Italy has quite a large stock of residential houses which are second homes. So it could be it's a very handy technology to cover that, because you can write relatively flexible contracts. So basically, you pay by the month. So you pay only the months that you're using the network, and so this can be this is a very attractive proposition, especially in such a context when you have to go for holiday homes and things like that. And yes, and then in part it's also a pricing issue, but generally the pricing in Italy is very competitive. So I think it's less the pricing issue; it is just the delivery of all the availability, because the other networks are not available to the extent or to the performance that is desired, or basically to the convenience and flexibility of the contract.
Okay, thank you. Then one last question to you, Philipp, before we come to our concluding remarks. You said before that there are very interesting use cases like for verticals like smart agriculture, which could then be extended to residential areas to provide better coverage. We learned there's enough funding available, but do need criteria to get those funds need to be changed over the next years to allow also for those kind of projects, or do you think everything is already in place?
I had an interruption of 5 seconds of sound, so I didn't catch your last.
Okay, the question was, you mentioned before that FWA might also be deployed for verticals like smart agriculture and then expanding it to residential homes. And we know that there's enough funds available. Do the criteria to get funding need to be changed to make all of those kind of projects eligible for this funding, or is everything in place?
That's an interesting question. We have, as Marit knows, also this discussion with our colleagues of DG Competition, because it all relies on definition of markets and step change in markets and so on. But insofar as there is no public financing involved, I mean, that's a commercial opportunity for these operators to open up probably to residential service if they bring 5G for other purposes, for smart agriculture or whatever usage. We had a kind of concrete case which was not fixed wireless access, but it was in the context of CEF, Connecting Europe Facility funding of 5G corridors, whether or not the operators could use the same infrastructure, which is so partially publicly financed, to expand mobile coverage around the highways, potentially in competition with other operators. And as you can imagine, this is in principle not possible. So there is a lot of, let's say, I wouldn't say education, that would be condescending, but there is a lot of thinking that has to be done in terms of competition of state aid criteria to optimize this possibility. But from a technical viewpoint and an economic viewpoint, it's a no-brainer. The more you have the fiber everywhere, the more you have opportunities to connect also residential areas, including through fixed wireless access. Fixed wireless access is a bit like, this machine to put nails on the wall that you have to fix on the wall with 2 nails. So in other words, fixed wireless access is only good if you have fiber next to it. So it will very much depend on the fiber network. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you, Philipp. That brings me to a final question to each of you, with the ask to answer it by 30 seconds maybe. So which role do you see fixed wireless access playing in 2030? Marit, ladies first, of course.
Well, potentially still important, but perhaps marginal.
Okay, thank you. Harold?
Yes, I tend to have the same approach, because I think by that time there will be sufficient money being spent on basically rolling out infrastructure, so that this niche technology has a relatively small market.
Okay, thank you. Philipp?
I think I'll conclude by a joke. I hope that fixed wireless access is not like Brazil. It was the technology of the future. It is the technology of it. It will always be. But I would also bet on my aerial deployment of fiber. I don't know why we never speak about that, but there must be a reason.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you very much all for this fascinating discussion and your contribution. I think it was a very lively discussion. There are a lot of topics we could talk about even longer, but we're running out of time. So thank you all. And let me conclude the session together with Stephanie from the first panel. Yes, as I said, very many new insights. I think the key question will be looking ahead a couple of years of time, which role will fixed wireless access play? Will it be a temporary solution? Will it be a niche solution which is here to stay? I think there's enough money available to fund those kind of projects, and also this synergetic views I think were quite interesting. We also learned that, of course, private funding should have priority, and looking forward on the, let's say, softening of the clear market failure scenario parameters, what that will bring for fixed wireless access deployments in future. Thank you very much for your attention. It was a pleasure to host this panel. And over to you, Dan.
Michael, thank you very much. And I'm just going to bring Stephanie up as well. And I'd just like to say, yeah, Michael, thank you. A really interesting discussion. And thank you, of course, to our three panelists in that session we just had, to Marit, to Harold, and to Philippe. So a really interesting discussion. And of course, again, thank you to everyone out there in the audience for all of your questions and thoughts as well. And Michael, I think you've summed that up very well, the discussion as part of that session there. Maybe, Stephanie, I can pass to you to give maybe some concluding remarks or concluding thoughts that you might have from your side with the earlier session that we had today that you were involved in, or more broadly on the discussions that we've had.
Yeah, thank you, Dan, and very interesting discussion for session 2. Obviously, funding is a very important part. Having worked on the fiber side of it, there's a lot of willingness from private investors. So it was very well highlighted and combined with public funding to make fixed wireless access a success. I have just 7 points, very brief. I swear to you, it's going to be very quick. So what will make fixed wireless access a success? It's the availability of spectrum. So we see that it's deployed in mid bands, but there are high bands. The 26 gigahertz, for example, in Italy, a question was on that just earlier. Micromillimeter waves also. The availability of devices, the ecosystem, the upcoming evolutions for 5G fixed wireless access, 6G, and obviously the other Gs, as I was mentioning in session 1. There's also one question we haven't touched on, and it's about regulation linked, is the place of infrastructure players in deploying the technology. We talked a lot about MNOs, but there are a lot of towercos now that are emerging, and they should have a say in deployment and a place in deploying fixed wireless access. We touch on private-public funding. Digital skills, educating the population on the technology, and that fixed wireless access can be as good as in fiber in some cases, or at least a good option in white areas or where fiber cannot be deployed because of geographical typologies, for example, and what you can do with it on a B2B and B2C basis. There's the question of copper switch off that we haven't had time to touch on. How do you connect the rural areas where they won't have access to legacy copper telephony networks, for example? And obviously tying all of this together with the green agenda, which is very high on the Commission agenda. So those are the points to wrap up on my side. Thank you very much.
Stephanie, thank you very much. And you mentioned you finished off by mentioning the green agenda there, and I note that I think I've done a recent report looking at kind of recovering with fixed wireless access and fiber for a green and competitive Europe. And if it's okay, we'll maybe share that report in the folder for the participants here. There we are. Perfect. So we'll share a link to that in the folder for all the participants here who are interested in finding finding more about that. But thank you so much, and I'm going to bring Mikhail back up. And again, Mikhail, thank you very much again.
Thank you.
For your thoughts, and also for expertly moderating the session. To both of you, had some really interesting discussions. So thank you both very much indeed for that. So we've heard some conclusions from Mikhail and from Stephanie there, and I think they've wrapped things up very well. I mean, maybe just a couple of final thoughts from my side as well. So I think we've had really interesting 3.5 hours or so, and we fitted a lot in. We've heard about the potential of fixed wireless access, and we've heard a number of different examples in countries, in different member states, for the extent to which it has already been rolled out. For example, Finland, Norway, possibly we heard in the first session it's more advanced in terms of the rollout, and maybe less so currently in Greece, although we did hear from Kostas about the potential that he feels FWA could bring, and the possible avenues that are available to help enable this, I suppose. We heard about how the ecosystem for fixed wireless access is growing. We heard the evolution of technology from Patrick. And also, I think we discovered, it was more than half of LTE operators in Europe have now launched FWA, and it's, I guess, means that costs for both hardware and services are dropping, and hopefully becoming more of a viable solution. We talked a bit about the spectrum and connectivity requirements. Millimeter wave, of course, was discussed as one option. But then there's also the option or the possibility of using the upper 6 gigahertz band for the technology. But that, of course, depends on some of the discussions which are taking place both within Europe and elsewhere in the world at the moment ahead of WRC 23 with regards to whether that spectrum is made available on a licensed or an unlicensed basis. But again, something else that came into the discussions. And then in the second session, as we've just heard from Mikhail, we moved on to focus more on different funding mechanisms that are available to help roll out fixed wireless access and other technologies to meet these targets that have been set in Europe, and also specifically, I suppose, to help provide broadband connectivity in those commercially less viable areas, so rural, sparsely populated scenarios and things like that. And we also heard the very welcome supportive position from Harold of EIB to help co-finance investment. So I think overall the conclusions that I can take from the event is that it seems that FWA has a huge potential if taken as a supplement alongside 5G and other technologies to contribute to the achievement of the European connectivity targets that have been set. The fact that it's been recognised by BEREC as a very high capacity network, it means it qualifies for funding as part of many different mechanisms that are in place to deliver the gigabit society. But it seems that there's only limited examples of this being taken advantage of with the public funding that's available, with the Connected Rural Broadband Fund, RRF, and more. So hopefully platforms like this are helpful in raising the awareness of some of these public funding mechanisms that are available and of how to access those. So I think that's just about it. I'd like to once again say a very big thank you to all of our sponsors, all of our partner organizations for the event. Of course, all of our speakers, our panelists. We've had some really interesting discussions as I've just mentioned, and of course to all of you out there. Really appreciate your involvement at the event, and very much appreciate all of your comments and questions and the contribution that you have made to the discussions as well. So thank you all very much. And finally, I'd like to maybe finish with a shameless plug for our next event that we have coming up, looking at these issues. So we have our European Spectrum Management Conference, which is taking place as part of the Global Spectrum Series. So that's going to be taking place on the 8th and 9th of June. You are going to be able to access that virtually. It will be happening as a virtual event, but it will also be happening in person in Brussels. So we encourage as many of you as possible to hopefully come and join us in Brussels. It'll be the first time in 3 years, for obvious reasons, that we've had the chance to get together in person. So really hope that as many of you as possible are able to join us for that. And we're going to be looking at, I'm sure, fixed wireless access and a lot of other connectivity issues around spectrum management and things within Europe. So hope to see many of you there. But for now, thank you all so much. Really appreciate all of your participation. Have a good rest of the day, and look forward to hopefully seeing you again very soon. Thank you, everyone.